The sun peeked through the purple butterfly curtains as the little girl sat on the edge of her bed, still a bit sleepy but excited about the day ahead. The smell of pancakes drifted up from the kitchen downstairs, mixing with the gentle sound of her mom humming an old soul tune, the same one she always hummed while cooking breakfast. In front of her mirror, decorated with stickers from her favorite cartoons, she watched as her mom's fingers moved skillfully through her hair, creating neat rows of braids. "Hold still, sweetheart," her mom said softly, carefully parting another section. "You've got to look extra special today for your presentation." The girl couldn't help but wiggle a little with excitement. She had spent all weekend working on her project about butterflies. Her bedroom walls were covered with drawings she had made: orange monarchs, blue morphos, and purple emperors. She had even learned how to spell metamorphosis all by herself. "Did you practice your speech again?" her mom asked, securing another braid with a bright yellow hair tie. The girl nodded enthusiastically, almost messing up the braid her mom was working on. "3 times. And I showed it to Grandma on video chat too. She said I spoke as clear as a news reporter." Her mom smiled at that, the kind of proud smile that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. On the dresser lay her carefully pressed school uniform, a crisp white shirt and navy blue skirt. Her shoes were polished and ready by the door, and her favorite purple backpack was packed with everything she needed, including the special folder holding her presentation papers. "You know what?" her mom said, putting the finishing touches on the last braid. "I packed you an extra special lunch today. Those strawberry cookies you love so much. I made them fresh last night after you went to bed." The girl's eyes lit up like Christmas lights, and she threw her arms around her mom's waist in a tight hug. As she got dressed, she practiced her presentation one more time in front of her mirror. "Butterflies are some of the most amazing creatures in the world," she declared to her reflection, standing as tall as her 9-year-old frame will allow. Her mom watched from the doorway, holding back happy tears at how grown up her baby girl looked. Downstairs, the kitchen was warm and cozy. Her big sister was already at the table, nose buried in a high school textbook while munching on pancakes. The morning news played quietly on the small kitchen TV, but nobody was really listening. They were all caught up in their own thoughts about the day ahead. The girl ate her breakfast carefully, making sure not to get any syrup on her uniform. She had arranged her pancakes into a smiley face with banana slices for eyes, just like her mom used to do for her when she was younger. Even though she was in 4th grade now, some traditions were too sweet to give up. Just before it was time to leave, she checked her backpack one last time. Homework folder, pencil case with her lucky pencil, the butterfly presentation in its special folder, and her lunchbox with those promised strawberry cookies. Everything was perfect. She had no way of knowing that this ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become anything but ordinary. This was supposed to be her big day, a day for sharing her love of butterflies with her class. She stood by the front door, adjusting her backpack straps, while her mom grabbed the car keys. The morning sun made the dew on the front lawn sparkle like tiny diamonds, and somewhere in the distance, birds were singing their morning songs. It was the kind of perfect morning that made you believe nothing could possibly go wrong. The morning at school started perfectly. When it came time for her presentation, the little girl stood confidently at the front of her classroom, sharing everything she knew about butterflies. Her classmates listened attentively, especially when she showed them the colorful drawings she'd made. Her teacher beamed with pride, giving her a gold star sticker that she carefully placed on her folder. By the time recess rolled around, the spring air was warm and inviting. The playground next to the school was their special paradise, a place where imaginations could run wild. The grass was freshly cut, leaving that sweet smell that only spring brings, and dandelions dotted the field like tiny yellow stars. The children poured out of the school building like honey from a jar, their laughter filling the air. Some headed straight for the swings, while others gathered near the big oak tree that provided perfect shade for their games. The little girl and her friends had their own special spot, a corner of the playground near the climbing frame where they loved to play. Today, they were playing their favorite game of tag with a twist they'd made up themselves. Whoever was it had to hop on one foot while trying to catch others. It made everyone giggle seeing their friends bounce around like rabbits. The little girl was particularly good at this game, quick on her feet, and always coming up with clever ways to dodge the person who was it. Near the playground equipment, a new slide had just been installed. It was shiny and blue, and everyone was excited to try it out. The teachers had made a rule that morning: take turns, one at a time, to make sure everyone stayed safe. The little girl waited patiently for her turn, counting the people ahead of her just like her teacher had taught them. That's when things started to change. Another student, who hadn't been waiting in line, rushed to climb up the slide from the bottom while the little girl was getting ready to go down. She tried to explain about taking turns, just like they'd been told. Her voice was polite. She even used please and thank you, like her mom had always taught her. A few other kids gathered around, some agreeing with her about the rules, others just watching to see what would happen. Their voices got a little louder as they discussed who should go first, but there was no pushing or shoving. It was just children trying to figure things out, the way kids do every day on playgrounds all over the world. The teacher's aide, who was watching the playground that day, started walking over to help sort things out. She had seen the whole thing and knew it was just a normal playground discussion that needed a grown-up's gentle guidance. But before she could reach them, something unexpected happened. A person living in one of the houses next to the playground had been watching through their window. Without coming out to ask what was happening, without speaking to the teachers or the children, they made a phone call that would change everything. The little girl, still standing at the top of the slide, had no idea that someone was making assumptions about her based only on what they thought they saw. The children continued their discussion about taking turns, their voices carrying across the playground, mixed with laughter from other games being played nearby. A group of younger kids were making daisy chains in the grass, and the basketball court was filled with the rhythmic bouncing of balls. It was such a normal scene, the kind that plays out on elementary school playgrounds everywhere. The teacher's aide was just a few steps away now, ready to remind everyone about taking turns and being kind to each other. The little girl noticed a butterfly, ironically just like the ones from her morning presentation, floating past on the spring breeze. She pointed it out to her classmates, momentarily forgetting about the slide situation, and they all watched it dance through the air. None of them noticed the police cars pulling up to the school gates. None of them realized that their ordinary playground disagreement was about to become something much bigger, much scarier, and completely unfair. The little girl was still smiling, thinking about how she could include this moment in her butterfly journal at home, unaware that in just a few minutes, her world would be turned upside down. The first sign that something was wrong was the flash of red and blue lights reflecting off the school's windows. The cheerful playground chatter dimmed as two police cars pulled up to the curb, their tires crunching on the gravel. The little girl, still standing near the slide, felt her heart skip a beat when she saw the serious looks on the officers' faces as they stepped out of their vehicles. She remembered the talk her parents had given her about police officers, that they were there to help, that she should always be polite, and that she should stay calm if they ever needed to talk to her. She took a deep breath, just like her mom had taught her to do when she felt nervous before a test or a presentation. The playground fell eerily quiet. Even the little kids making daisy chains stopped to watch. The teacher's aide stepped forward, confused about why police would come to a school playground. Her hand instinctively reached out towards the children, as if to shield them from what was about to happen. "Everyone stay where you are," one of the officers called out, his voice much louder than necessary for a playground full of children. The little girl noticed how different these officers looked from Officer Brown, the friendly community officer who sometimes visited their school to teach safety lessons. These officers didn't smile. They didn't wave. They walked with stiff shoulders and stern faces. The sun felt suddenly too bright, and the little girl wished she could disappear into the shadow of the slide. She could feel her classmates' eyes darting between her and the approaching officers. The butterfly from earlier was long gone, and now the only thing floating in the air was tension. Her purple backpack felt heavy on her shoulders, still carrying her precious butterfly presentation from that morning. Just hours ago, she'd been so proud of those carefully colored pictures and neatly written facts. Now, she'd hugged the backpack to her chest like a shield, her gold star sticker catching the sunlight. The officers moved quickly across the playground, their heavy boots thudding against the ground. Other teachers had started coming out of the school building, drawn by the unusual scene unfolding during what should have been a normal recess. The little girl could see her homeroom teacher rushing toward them, waving her arms and calling out to the officers. She tried to remember everything that had happened by the slide. They were just talking about taking turns, weren't they? She hadn't done anything wrong. She'd even used her please and thank you words. Her legs felt wobbly. Like that time, she tried to walk on the balance beam in gym class. The bigger of the two officers reached for something on his belt, and the little girl's eyes grew wide. She'd never had a grown-up look at her the way these officers were looking at her now. It made her stomach feel funny, like when you miss a step going down the stairs. Some of her classmates had started to cry, which made her want to cry too, but she remembered what her grandmother always said about being brave. She stood as straight as she could, trying to look grown-up, even though she felt very, very small. The gold butterfly clips in her braids caught the sunlight, sending tiny sparkles dancing across her shoulders. The teacher's aide was speaking quickly now, trying to explain about the slide and the taking turns and how everything was just a normal playground disagreement. But the officers weren't listening. They moved closer, and the little girl could see their badges glinting in the sun. She wanted to explain, too, to tell them about the rules they'd learned that morning about the new slide, but her voice seemed to be hiding somewhere deep in her throat. Time seemed to slow down, like in those movies where everything moves like it's underwater. She could hear her heart beating in her ears, could feel the rough texture of her backpack under her fingers, could smell the fresh-cut grass that just moments ago had made the playground feel so perfect. A bell rang somewhere inside the school, but nobody moved. Nobody ran to line up like they usually did when recess ended. The little girl looked toward the school building, hoping to see her mom walking through the doors for the parent-teacher meeting they had scheduled for later that day. But her mom wasn't there yet. Instead, she saw more teachers running toward the playground, their faces showing worry she'd never seen before. The whole world seemed to be moving in slow motion, except for the officers who were now standing right in front of her, their shadows falling across her face like storm clouds on what had started as a perfect spring day. The playground had become as quiet as a library after closing time. The little girl felt like she was in a bubble, where everything looked clear but sounded far away. Her classmates had formed a circle around her and the officers, some holding hands, others clutching their shirts or twisting their shoelaces. Nervous habits that came out when they were scared or worried. "What's going on here?" the taller officer demanded, his voice sharp like the edge of a ruler. The little girl opened her mouth to explain about the slide and taking turns, but before she could get the words out, several voices started speaking all at once. "We were just playing," one of her friends called out. "Nobody was fighting," said another. "She was only telling us about the line rules," a third voice added. The teacher's aide stepped forward, her hands raised in a calming gesture. "Officers, I was right here the whole time. These children were simply discussing the rules for the new slide. There's been a misunderstanding." Her voice was steady but urgent, like when she reminded kids not to run in the hallway. But something strange was happening. The officers weren't listening to anyone else. Their eyes stayed fixed on the little girl, who still clutched her purple backpack like it could somehow make her invisible. She noticed how one officer kept his hand near his belt, and she remembered the safety presentations at school, how they were taught that police officers carried tools to help keep people safe. But right now, those tools didn't make her feel safe at all. Her homeroom teacher had reached them now, slightly out of breath from running across the playground. "Officers, please," she said, placing herself partially between them and the little girl. "I'm her teacher. These are fourth graders discussing playground rules. Nothing more." The little girl felt a tear roll down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away with her sleeve. She wanted to be brave, like the butterflies in her presentation that weren't afraid to spread their wings and fly even when the wind was strong. But this felt different from any kind of brave she'd ever had to be before. One of her braids had come loose, and the butterfly clip was dangling near her ear. She wanted to fix it. Her mom always said to keep her hair neat, but she was afraid to move. The officers' faces looked like thunderclouds, dark and promising storm, even as more teachers arrived to explain the situation. Through the crowd, she could see the person who had called the police watching from their window next door. They weren't coming out to tell the officers they'd made a mistake. They just stood there, behind their curtain, watching as a little girl's ordinary Tuesday turned into something that felt like a bad dream. She was being disruptive. The neighbor had told the police over the phone. But the little girl wondered how anyone could think that kids talking about taking turns was disruptive. She'd learned that word in vocabulary class. It meant causing trouble or disorder. But there hadn't been any trouble until the police cars arrived. Her friends were crying now, and some had run to get more teachers. The basketball that had been bouncing cheerfully just minutes ago rolled forgotten across the playground. The half-finished daisy chains lay abandoned in the grass. Everything that made recess special had disappeared in the shadow of what was happening. The school principal came rushing out, papers flying from her hands in her hurry. She looked worried in a way the little girl had never seen before, not even during fire drills or when someone got hurt on the playground. But before she could reach them, before she could add her voice to the chorus of adults trying to explain, the officers had made up their minds. The little girl looked down at her shoes, the ones her mom had polished just that morning, and saw another tear fall, making a dark spot on the concrete. She could see her reflection in her shiny black shoes, distorted and wavy, like looking into a funhouse mirror. Except there was nothing fun at this moment, nothing fun about the way the officers were ignoring every voice trying to tell them the truth about what had happened. All around her, the world seemed to be moving in two speeds at once, too fast and too slow. She wished she could go back to that morning when her biggest worry was remembering all the facts about butterfly migration for her presentation. But instead, she stood frozen, watching as one officer reached for something at his belt, while the other stepped closer, his shadow completely covering her now, turning her perfect spring day into the scariest moment of her young life. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion, yet too fast to stop. The little girl heard a clicking sound that she'd only heard before on TV shows. When she looked down, she saw cold metal circles around her tiny wrists, handcuffs that looked too big, too harsh against her skin. Her purple backpack slipped from her shoulders and fell to the ground, the butterfly folder spilling out onto the concrete. Her whole body started trembling, like the time she'd forgotten her jacket on a cold winter day. But this wasn't from the cold. This was a different kind of shaking that came from deep inside. More tears fell now, making quiet paths down her cheeks as she tried to be brave, just like her parents had taught her. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the spring breeze. "I want my mommy." The words came out wobbly, like when she tried to talk while jumping rope. But she wasn't jumping rope now. She was standing still, more still than she'd ever stood in her 9 years of life. Her classmates had gone from shocked silence to frightened crying. Some were calling out, "She didn't do anything wrong." Their voices merged together like a sad song nobody wanted to hear. The teacher's aide was on her phone, frantically trying to reach the little girl's mother, while other teachers were still attempting to reason with the officers. The loose butterfly clip finally fell from her braid, landing near her feet with a small plastic sound that seemed too loud in her ears. She wanted to pick it up. It was her favorite one. the one her grandmother had given her for her last birthday, but her hands wouldn't move the way she wanted them to anymore. Through her tears, she could see her presentation papers scattered on the ground, the gold star sticker from earlier now dusty and scratched. The butterfly drawings she'd worked so hard on were being stepped on, the careful coloring smudged by hurrying feet. One page had caught the breeze and was floating away, like the real butterfly from earlier, but this one didn't look free. It looked lost. "Please," she managed to say, trying to remember all the polite words her parents had taught her. "I was just telling about taking turns. Like we learned in morning assembly." Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, higher than usual and shaky, like when she'd try to sing while crying. The principal was still there, still trying to explain, her voice getting louder and more urgent. "This is completely unnecessary. She's a child, a fourth grader. Look at her. She still has her presentation materials from this morning's class." But the officers seemed to have built a wall around themselves, one that no words could break through. Other students had started recording with their phones. They'd seen their parents do this when things weren't right. Even with their young hands shaking, they knew somehow that this needed to be remembered, needed to be shown to people who could help make sense of it all. The little girl's legs felt wobbly, like they'd turned into the jelly her mom put on her sandwiches. She looked down at her shiny shoes again, but now they were blurry through her tears. The shoes her mom had polished that morning felt like they belonged to a different day, a different life, when everything made sense and playground rules were the biggest worry in her world. Someone had picked up her purple backpack and was holding it like a precious thing, like something that needed to be protected. The butterfly folder was being carefully gathered up by her friends, who were picking up every scattered page as if they were collecting pieces of a broken heart. "I want to go home," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. The words caught in her throat like moths trapped in a jar. The handcuffs felt heavier with each passing moment, pulling her arms down, making her shoulders hurt in a way that had nothing to do with carrying books or playing on the monkey bars. The playground equipment cast long shadows now, stretching across the ground like reaching hands that couldn't quite help. The same slide that had started all this stood silent and empty, its new blue surface reflecting the spring sun, oblivious to how it had become part of a story that should never have been told. Time seemed to have stopped for everyone except the officers, who were now leading her away from her friends, away from her teachers, away from the butterfly drawings and gold stars and everything that had made this morning feel so perfect. Each step felt like walking through deep water, heavy and slow, as she left behind not just her scattered presentation, but also a piece of childhood innocence that she would never get back. Word spread through the community like wildfire. It started with text messages from concerned parents whose children had witnessed the incident, then moved to local parent group chats, and finally exploded on social media. By dinner time, videos taken by students had been shared thousands of times, each view bringing new waves of disbelief and anger. The first community meeting happened that very evening in the local church basement. People came straight from work, still in their uniforms and office clothes, carrying hastily made signs and heavy hearts. The room meant for 50 somehow squeezed in over 200 concerned neighbors, their voices mixing with the hum of old fluorescent lights overhead. "My daughter was there," one parent stood up to say, their voice shaking. "She came home and couldn't stop crying. She kept asking why this happened to her friend." How do I explain this to a 9-year-old? The room fell quiet, filled only with the sound of people wiping tears and shuffling feet. Local shop owners started putting out purple butterflies in their windows, a symbol that grew from the little girl's scattered presentation papers. The bakery on Main Street made butterfly-shaped cookies and donated all the money to the family's legal fund. Even the grumpy owner of the hardware store, who rarely participated in community events, hung a huge purple butterfly banner across his storefront. The school playground became a gathering place every evening. Parents brought candles, creating a gentle glow that seemed to push back against the darkness of what had happened. Children left drawings and letters, many featuring butterflies and messages of love. Teachers who had witnessed the arrest shared their stories with local news reporters, their voices strong despite their tears. Social media couldn't get enough of the story. A video of the incident went viral, catching the attention of national news networks. Celebrities started sharing it, adding their own messages of support and calls for justice. The hashtag Butterfly Effect started trending, becoming a symbol for innocent childhood moments destroyed by prejudice. Civil rights organizations stepped forward, offering legal support and guidance. Lawyers in crisp suits arrived at the family's home, carrying briefcases full of papers and hearts full of determination to right this wrong. They spoke in gentle voices to the little girl, promising to help make sure this wouldn't happen to other children. The neighbor who had called the police that day kept their curtains drawn, but they couldn't hide from the community's response. Hundreds of paper butterflies appeared on their fence overnight, each one carrying a message about childhood innocence and the importance of seeing with your heart instead of prejudice. Local artists created murals on approved walls around the city. They painted huge, beautiful butterflies in every color imaginable, adding quotes about childhood, innocence, and justice. Children would stop to touch the painted wings, their parents explaining in quiet voices why these butterflies meant so much more than just pretty pictures. The school principal organized a special assembly about kindness and understanding. She invited community leaders to speak, but the most powerful moment came when the little girl's classmates shared their own feelings. Their words were simple but profound, showing how clearly children can see right and wrong. "We were just talking about taking turns," one student said, holding a purple butterfly drawing. "That's what grown-ups teach us to do. Why did being nice get our friend in trouble?" The question hung in the air, heavy with truth that no adult could easily answer. Churches, temples, and mosques in the area all spoke about justice and protecting children in their services that week. Prayer groups formed, not just to pray, but to plan actions that would help prevent similar incidents in the future. They organized peaceful gatherings where people of all faiths came together, holding hands and sharing hopes for change. The local ice cream shop created a new flavor called Butterfly Swirl. Purple vanilla ice cream with butterfly-shaped sprinkles. All proceeds went to organizations working to protect children's rights. The line for this special ice cream stretched around the block every day, with people waiting patiently, sharing stories, and signing petitions while they waited. Even the weather seemed to join in. That week, an unusual number of actual butterflies appeared in the city's parks and gardens. People took it as a sign, a reminder that something beautiful could emerge from this painful chrysalis of injustice. Children would point them out, whispering the little girl's name like a wish for better days. The internal affairs investigation began on a Wednesday morning in a room filled with serious-faced officials watching body camera footage for the 5th time. The video showed exactly what the children and teachers had said. A simple playground discussion about taking turns on a slide, nothing more. The investigators kept rewinding to the moment before the police arrived, searching for any sign of the disruption the neighbor had reported. They found none. One investigator, a mother herself, had to step out of the room while watching the footage. The sound of the little girl's voice asking for her mom hit too close to home. When she returned, her notebook was damp with tears she tried to hide, but her writing was steady as she documented every detail that showed how wrong this response had been. The department's records revealed a troubling pattern. In the past year alone, there had been 15 similar calls about children of color playing in public spaces. Each time, the response had been unnecessarily severe. The statistics couldn't be ignored. They told a story of bias that had gone unchecked for far too long. "Look at this," one investigator said, pointing to his computer screen. "The neighbor who called has made similar complaints 6 times in the past 3 months. All about children of color, all doing normal childhood activities." He shuffled through paper reports, each one showing how a simple moment of play had been twisted into something suspicious. The school's security cameras added another layer to the investigation. From 4 different angles, they showed the playground that day. The footage was crystal clear. Children playing, laughing, discussing rules. The teachers were attentive, the situation was calm, until the police arrived. The investigators watched as the cameras caught the exact moment when childhood innocence collided with unfair judgment. Local news stations camped outside the police department, their cameras recording every person who walked in or out. Inside, more officers were being interviewed, their faces showing different emotions, some defensive, others clearly troubled by what had happened. A young officer admitted he'd seen similar responses before but had been afraid to speak up. The teacher's aide, who had witnessed everything, wrote a 10-page statement. Her words painted a picture so clear it made readers feel like they were there. She described how the children had been learning about conflict resolution that very morning, how they were practicing using their words instead of actions. The irony was not lost on the investigators. Community members came forward with their own videos and stories. A grandmother who lived across from the school had been tending her roses that day. She described how the children were doing exactly what they'd been taught, taking turns, using their words, being respectful. Her testimony added another piece to the puzzle. The investigators discovered that the officers involved had never completed the department's updated training on interacting with children. Their personnel files showed they'd missed several required sessions about community engagement and bias awareness. This gap in training became a critical point in understanding how things had gone so wrong. The little girl's butterfly presentation became evidence too. Investigators looked at her carefully drawn pictures, her neat handwriting, the gold star sticker now slightly crumpled. These weren't just school papers anymore. They were proof of the childhood moment that had been interrupted, of the innocence that had been challenged too soon. Social workers interviewed the little girl's classmates, using gentle questions and drawing exercises to help them express what they'd seen. The children's pictures told the story in crayon and marker. Stick figures by a slide, police cars with two bright lights, and butterflies flying away. Their honest accounts brought tears to even the most experienced investigators' eyes. As the investigation continued, more uncomfortable truths emerged. Previous complaints about over-policing at playgrounds had been filed but ignored. Community members had raised concerns at city council meetings, but their words had fallen on deaf ears. The system's gaps and failures were being exposed, one document at a time. The department's training protocols were put under the microscope. Role-play scenarios, response guidelines, racial bias training. Everything was reviewed. The investigators found outdated materials, missed opportunities for improvement, and a culture that sometimes valued quick response over careful understanding. The weeks following the incident brought changes nobody could have predicted. The little girl's bedroom, once filled with butterfly drawings and happy school projects, now had a different feel. Her colored pencils lay untouched on her desk, and her favorite purple backpack stayed hidden in the closet. At night, she would wake up crying, reaching for her mom's hand in the darkness. Her mother noticed how her daughter's eyes would dart around nervously whenever they left the house, especially when they saw police cars. Simple things like walking to the corner store or playing in their front yard became challenges. The little girl would grip her mother's hand tighter, her palm sweaty with worry that someone might misunderstand her actions again. School wasn't the same anymore either. The playground that had once been her favorite place now felt different. She would sit on the steps during recess, watching other children play, but rarely joining in. Her teachers noticed how she kept checking over her shoulder, as if expecting something bad to happen at any moment. "Baby, would you like to draw some butterflies?" Her mother would ask gently each evening, trying to help her daughter return to the things she loved. But the little girl would shake her head, saying the butterflies didn't feel safe anymore. Those words broke her mother's heart more than any tears could. The school counselor worked with her 3 times a week, using art therapy and gentle conversation to help her process what happened. They made worry dolls together, tiny fabric friends who would listen to her fears at night. Slowly, very slowly, she started to share her feelings through these little cloth companions. Her grandmother moved in temporarily to help, bringing her special tea and telling stories from her own childhood. During these quiet moments, sitting in the kitchen with steam rising from their cups, the little girl would sometimes smile, brief flashes of her old self showing through the clouds of anxiety. Her classmates showed support in their own sweet ways. They would save her favorite flavor of juice at lunch, even though she wasn't sitting with them yet. They made her cards covered in butterfly stickers, leaving them carefully on her desk each morning. One friend even learned to make origami butterflies, placing a new one in her cubby every day. The teacher's aide who had witnessed everything started a healing circle at school. Children would sit together during lunch, sharing their feelings about what happened and their hopes for the future. Through these conversations, they learned about empathy, justice, and the power of standing up for each other. At home, nighttime became the hardest. The little girl would check her closet multiple times before bed, making sure no uniforms were hiding there. Her mom installed twinkle lights around her room, stars to keep the darkness away. They developed a special bedtime routine, 3 stories, 2 songs, and 1 promise that tomorrow might be better. The family started attending therapy together, learning ways to help their daughter feel safe again. The therapist, a kind woman with plants in her office, taught them breathing exercises and grounding techniques. When you feel scared, she explained, touch something purple. It's your power color. Soon, purple objects appeared all around their house, little anchors of comfort. Some days were harder than others. A slamming door could make her jump. The sight of handcuffs on TV would send her running to her room. But there were good moments too, times when her laugh would ring out suddenly, surprising everyone with its brightness, like sun breaking through storm clouds. Her dad built her a small garden in their backyard, planting flowers that would attract real butterflies. See, he would tell her, they still come to visit you. Sometimes she would sit there after school, watching the insects dance from flower to flower, free and unafraid. These moments became tiny steps toward healing. The community continued to show up. Neighbors would leave encouraging notes in their mailbox. The local librarian saved butterfly books for her, even though she wasn't ready to read them yet. The ice cream shop owner never charged her family, saying their presence alone was payment enough. Each small kindness helped build a cushion of safety around her. Like pieces of a quilt stitched together with care and love, these gestures created a new kind of protection. It wasn't the same as the innocent security she'd had before, but it was something real and strong, woven from the hearts of people who understood that healing takes time. 6 months after that spring day on the playground, things began to shift in ways both big and small. The police department announced major changes in their training programs, starting with a new rule. Every officer had to spend time volunteering at local schools, not as authority figures, but as mentors and friends. They would join in art classes, help with reading, and yes, even learn about taking turns on the playground. The little girl's story had sparked something that couldn't be ignored. City council meetings, once sparsely attended, now overflowed with parents, teachers, and community members. They shared stories, suggested changes, and worked together to create new guidelines for how police should interact with children. The neighbor who made the call that day even stood up at one meeting, tears streaming down their face, to apologize and promise to do better. In schools across the city, a new program called Butterfly Buddies took flight. Children learned about empathy, understanding differences, and speaking up when they saw something wrong. The little girl's butterfly drawings, once scattered on the playground, became the symbol for this program. Colorful posters showing children of all backgrounds playing together decorated hallways, each one featuring a bright purple butterfly in the corner. The police department created a special community oversight board, making sure that parents and teachers had a say in how their neighborhoods were protected. Officers started carrying stickers instead of just badges and bubble wands alongside their other equipment. "We're here to protect childhood, not disrupt it," became their new motto. Slowly, very slowly, the little girl began to find her voice again. One day, during a Butterfly Buddies meeting, she raised her hand to share her story. Her words were soft but clear, like butterfly wings touching flower petals. The room fell silent as she spoke about that day, about her fears, and about her hopes for change. When she finished, her classmates surrounded her in a gentle group hug, their love forming a protective cocoon around her. Her mother noticed other changes too. The little girl started drawing again, but her art was different now. Alongside the butterflies, she drew pictures of children holding hands in circles, of police officers playing basketball with kids, of neighbors waving to each other across fences. Her artwork showed the world as it could be, as it should be. The story reached other cities, sparking similar changes across the country. Police departments began reviewing their policies, asking themselves hard questions about how they treated their youngest community members. The little girl's purple butterfly became a symbol that appeared on police cars and school buses alike, a reminder to see children as children first. On the one-year anniversary of that spring day, the community gathered in the park for a special celebration. Hundreds of real butterflies were released into the air, their wings catching sunlight as they soared toward freedom. The little girl stood with her family, watching them fly, her hand steady as she held her mother's. She wasn't trembling anymore. The old playground got a makeover too. New equipment was installed, but more importantly, new traditions were born. Every morning, children and teachers would gather to share a kindness moment before play began. They learned that taking turns and using words to solve problems weren't just rules. They were ways to show love and respect for each other. The biggest change came in the little girl herself. She started speaking at schools, her voice growing stronger with each telling of her story. She didn't just talk about what happened that day. She talked about hope, about change, and about how sometimes the hardest moments can lead to the most beautiful transformations. Her butterfly presentation, once scattered and torn, found a permanent home in the City Museum's new exhibition of community change. Next to it, visitors could write their own promises for making the world better. The wall filled up with colorful notes, each one a small commitment to seeing children with kinder eyes. As spring returned again, bringing new flowers and fresh beginnings, the little girl stood on her front porch one morning and saw something remarkable. A butterfly, bigger and more purple than any she'd seen before, landed on the railing right next to her. It stayed there, wings gently opening and closing, as if to say that sometimes the most powerful changes start with the smallest moments.